It started on one of those quiet golden mornings when the world feels calm enough to forget there's such a thing as trouble. The air smelled like fresh hay and damp soil, and the only sounds were birds fluttering between the tall oaks that framed the property. The ranch had always been a slice of peace. Wide pastures, a red barn that needed painting, and a few animals that made the land feel alive. But that peace ended the day the new neighbor moved in, Karen. The Homeowners Association had already warned everyone that a highly involved member was moving to the far edge of the development. Apparently, she had been vice chair of her old HOA board and was excited to bring her experience. That should have been the first red flag. Within a week of her arrival, her presence was known. She had sent letters about mailbox heights, garbage can visibility, and grass length. No one took her too seriously at first, until she decided to expand her sense of authority beyond her property line. The narrator, a ranch owner who'd lived there long before the HOA even existed, had been grandfathered in. His property technically bordered the HOA development but wasn't part of it. He could have animals, keep his old-style wooden fence, and run his land without their rules. The HOA didn't like that, but legally they couldn't do anything about it. That didn't stop Karen from trying. It began with her daily walks along the road, where she'd stop by the fence, arms crossed, muttering something about property value and livestock smells. Her voice carried over the fence one too many times. Then came the notes. Folded papers taped to the fence posts with comments about how the bull should be relocated and the barn repainted to match community standards. The narrator ignored them. He'd dealt with city types before, folks who moved to the countryside thinking it was just a prettier version of suburbia. But Karen wasn't like the others. She was determined. The first major incident came one afternoon when the narrator returned from the feed store to find the corner of his fence splintered and pushed inward. Tire tracks cut deep into the dirt, and a piece of silver bumper trim lay stuck in the grass. It didn't take long to figure out who was responsible. Karen's white SUV had a fresh dent and a scuff mark that looked suspiciously like fence paint. The fence wasn't just a boundary. It kept the bull Duke inside. Duke was a massive black-coated bull with a temperament that swung between lazy and territorial. Normally, he'd graze quietly, but when something threatened his space, he made it known. The narrator patched the fence quickly, worried Duke might test it if he sensed weakness. The next day, Karen was outside again, pretending to prune her hedges as if nothing had happened. She didn't offer an apology or even make eye contact. Instead, she posted something on the HOA's Facebook group about unsafe rural fencing causing visual clutter. That night, the narrator sat on his porch, watching Duke graze under the moonlight, and something in his gut told him this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't stop when they were wrong. They doubled down. Sure enough, a few mornings later, he woke to another sound, metal scraping against wood. He ran outside to find Karen's SUV nose deep into the same section of the fence. This time, there was no mistaking it. She had driven too close, probably while trying to inspect the boundary again. The damage was worse this time. Posts snapped, rails down, and Duke standing on the other side, staring at the intruding vehicle. The bull's breathing was heavy, his head lowered, the muscles in his neck tight. The SUV's engine sputtered and died as Karen sat frozen behind the wheel. Duke took a few slow steps forward, his hooves crunching over the broken fence. The narrator's heart pounded as he moved closer, trying not to spook the animal. But Duke didn't charge, at least not yet. He circled the front of the SUV, sniffing, then snorted, leaving a streak of steam across the hood. Karen fumbled for her phone, probably trying to call someone, police, HOA, maybe even animal control. Then Duke made his move. It wasn't a full-blown charge, but a sudden, powerful shove of his head against the SUV's bumper. The sound of metal crumpling echoed across the pasture. Karen screamed inside the car, her horn blaring in panic. Duke backed off, snorted again, and gave another nudge, denting the front even deeper before turning away, satisfied that the intruder had been dealt with. The narrator managed to get Duke back inside the fence line and called the sheriff to report the damage. When the deputies arrived, they found Karen standing beside her wrecked vehicle, still red-faced and furious. She claimed the bull had attacked her without reason, and that the narrator's property was a hazard to the neighborhood. But the tire marks told a different story. The deputies weren't buying it. They took photos, filed the report, and told Karen she was responsible for the property damage. Her outrage could probably be heard 3 counties away. She stormed off, vowing to take this to the board and make sure justice is served. By sundown, word had spread through the community. Some neighbors thought it was hilarious. Others were cautious, not wanting to get caught in the feud. But one thing was clear: Karen had declared war. The narrator replaced the broken section of the fence again, this time reinforcing it with stronger posts and a strand of electric wire. Nothing harmful, just enough to keep Duke from pushing against it if it gave way again. But deep down, he knew Karen wouldn't stop. She had that look in her eyes, the kind that saw other people's peace as a challenge. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from the HOA. It accused him of maintaining dangerous livestock, non-compliant fencing, and conduct unbecoming of a community neighbor. The irony wasn't lost on him. He wasn't even part of the HOA. But that didn't matter to Karen. She'd made it personal now. He folded the letter, set it aside, and looked out the window at Duke, who was standing proudly near the repaired fence, flicking his tail in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, Karen's SUV was gone, but her fight wasn't. He could feel it. Something bigger was coming. And by the look of the storm clouds building on the horizon, it wouldn't just be weather. By the time the weekend rolled around, the story of Karen's run-in with the bull had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Word traveled fast in small communities, especially ones run by an HOA that thrived on gossip and self-importance. Some folks couldn't stop laughing about it. Others were shocked, claiming the narrator should have better control over his animals. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood Karen, determined to reclaim her dignity one complaint letter at a time. She didn't waste a single day. By Monday morning, the narrator's mailbox was stuffed with a thick envelope stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside was a formal notice of violation printed on crisp paper that smelled faintly of cheap perfume and printer ink. It listed a dozen supposed infractions: unauthorized livestock, an unsafe perimeter fence, and behavior detrimental to the harmony of the neighborhood. Each paragraph sounded more ridiculous than the last. The kicker was the demand that he cease livestock operations within 30 days or face further legal action. The irony was laughable. His land wasn't even part of the HOA's jurisdiction. He had owned the property long before the development existed. The association had no legal power over him, but that didn't stop Karen from trying to bend the rules to her favor. She had somehow convinced the board to send that letter anyway, likely hoping he'd be intimidated into compliance. But intimidation didn't work here. Instead of responding, he quietly gathered his paperwork, deeds, permits, and a copy of the county map showing that his property sat just outside the HOA boundary. He made copies of everything just in case. Karen wasn't finished. Over the next week, she escalated her efforts. She began patrolling the road in front of his property like a self-appointed code enforcer. She took pictures of the barn, the fence, even the animals. Sometimes she'd stand at the edge of her driveway with her phone raised, narrating into it as though she were recording evidence for a court case. Once, the narrator spotted her trying to measure the height of his fence from the outside, holding a tape measure like it was a badge of authority. The neighbors started to notice. Some found her behavior amusing. Others were getting tired of her antics. The HOA board members began receiving calls. Complaints not about the narrator, but about Karen's obsessive crusade. Yet she only grew bolder. One evening, the narrator found a sign posted at the end of his driveway. Warning, dangerous animal ahead, proceed with caution. It had been printed on HOA letterhead, laminated, and nailed into the ground. That was the final straw. The next morning, he drove down to the county office and filed a formal complaint. The clerk, an older woman who'd seen her share of HOA disputes, recognized Karen's name immediately. She sighed, stamped the papers, and muttered something about another one of her crusades. The county official promised to send someone to speak with the HOA directly. Meanwhile, life on the ranch continued. Duke was fine, calm, content, and completely unaware of the drama his existence had caused. The repairs to the fence were holding strong, and the fields were greener than ever after a stretch of cool rain. But beneath the calm, Tension simmered. Karen had gone quiet for a few days, which was almost worse. Silence meant plotting. Sure enough, one Saturday morning, a caravan of HOA board members rolled up in their shiny SUVs. 4 of them stepped out, clipboards in hand, dressed like they were inspecting a construction site. Karen led the group, her sunglasses perched high and her expression full of smug confidence. They didn't set foot on his land, but they stood close enough to make their presence felt, muttering to each other as they pointed toward the fence and the barn. The narrator watched from the porch, arms crossed, letting them have their little show. He didn't say a word. When they finished their inspection, they left without acknowledging him. That night, another letter appeared in his mailbox, this one thicker than before. It included a fine for non-compliance with HOA standards, an attached inspection summary, and a new demand: remove the bull or face legal action for public endangerment. It was absurd. Laughable even, but it also showed just how far Karen was willing to go. She had somehow manipulated the board into treating his private land like HOA property. And when that didn't scare him off, she started a new tactic: weaponizing social pressure. Posts began circulating on the neighborhood Facebook group. Photos of Duke grazing behind the fence, captions warning of a dangerous animal near residential homes. Someone even uploaded a video of Karen's SUV after the bumper incident, claiming the bull had gone rogue and attacked without provocation. The comments were divided. Some sided with her, others called her dramatic. But the noise was growing, and it was starting to attract attention from people outside the neighborhood. A week later, a white truck with the county seal pulled up. Animal control had arrived. The officer who stepped out was professional and calm, clipboard in hand, ready to investigate the aggressive bull. The narrator led him around the property, explaining what had happened. Duke, as if on cue, was lounging under the oak tree, chewing lazily and occasionally flicking his tail. He didn't even look up as they walked by. The officer chuckled. After checking the fencing and verifying the ownership papers, the officer closed his file and shook his head. There was no violation, no issue, nothing remotely illegal. He promised to file a report clearing the situation and even apologized for the inconvenience. Karen, however, wasn't pleased. She stood at the edge of her driveway, watching the entire visit unfold, her arms crossed and jaw tight. When the officer left, she stormed back inside, slamming her door hard enough for the sound to carry. That night, a new post went up online, accusing the county of favoritism and the narrator of harassment through livestock intimidation. It was so over the top that even her usual supporters began backing away. Some neighbors started unfriending her. Others stopped waving when she passed by. But instead of backing down, she went even further. She began sending letters not just to the HOA, but directly to the sheriff's office and local zoning board, demanding emergency action. The narrator didn't respond. He stayed quiet, patient, knowing that her behavior was beginning to turn against her. The community was growing tired of her self-righteousness. Then, one morning, he found fresh tire marks in front of the same section of fence. Again. This time, it wasn't a full-on collision, just close enough to leave a few scratches on the wood. Someone had been there late at night. He checked the cameras he'd quietly installed a few days earlier. The footage showed Karen's SUV pulling up after dark, her headlights cutting through the fog. She stepped out, flashlight in hand, and paced along the fence line, clearly taking photos. Then, as she reversed, she clipped one of the corner posts. It was the 3rd time. The narrator stared at the footage, realizing that this wasn't about the HOA anymore. It had become personal. She wasn't trying to enforce rules, she was trying to provoke him. The next morning, he downloaded the footage, copied it to a USB drive, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. This time, it wasn't a complaint. It was evidence. And as he left the station, a faint sense of calm settled over him. The storm wasn't over, but the wind was starting to shift. Karen had started this fight. Now, for the first time, she might actually have to answer for it. By the time fall settled over the valley, the tension between the ranch and the HOA had reached a breaking point. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of rain and wood smoke, but beneath that calm was a quiet war no one could ignore. The narrator had tried to go about his days as usual, fixing equipment, tending the animals, mending the pasture, but he could feel eyes on him everywhere he went. Karen's campaign had spread beyond letters and gossip. It had become an obsession that consumed her every waking moment. The footage he had turned into the sheriff had started an investigation. For the first time, Karen was facing questions she couldn't deflect. The deputy who handled the case paid her a visit, asking why she had been on private property late at night. According to what the narrator later heard, she claimed she was conducting an HOA inspection for community safety. The deputy didn't buy it. Word spread quickly that Karen had been warned to stay away from the fence line. She was furious, embarrassed even, and like a cornered animal, she doubled down. Her posts online grew more aggressive, her tone more desperate. She accused the narrator of falsifying evidence, of training his bull to attack vehicles, and of destroying her reputation. The truth was simpler. Karen's ego had taken a hit, and she wanted payback. One windy afternoon, the narrator noticed something strange. The electric fence line he had installed months earlier was down in several places, the wire sagging like someone had intentionally loosened it. He checked the posts. 3 had been unscrewed, the caps removed. It was deliberate sabotage. He fixed it quickly, tightening the wire and checking every section for tampering. Duke watched him from the pasture, head tilted slightly as if he knew something wasn't right. The bull was calm most days, but even animals could sense bad intentions. That night, the sound of an engine broke the silence. It was faint at first, then closer. Headlights flashed briefly across the windows. The narrator stepped onto the porch just in time to see Karen's SUV creeping along the road again, her hazard lights blinking. He didn't move. He just watched as she stopped near the fence, rolled down her window, and shouted something he couldn't make out. Then she revved the engine and sped off. By morning, the fence was damaged again. This time, 2 posts cracked clean through and a section of the lower rail splintered. It wasn't from an animal. It was from a vehicle. Duke, thankfully, was still inside the pasture, pacing near the broken section, but not through it. The narrator reinforced the gap immediately, this time with heavier lumber and concrete at the base. Then, without a word, he called the sheriff again. The deputy arrived an hour later, took photos, and sighed when he saw the same tire marks leading away from the scene. It wasn't hard to figure out who was responsible. This time, Karen was cited for property damage and trespassing. It wasn't a major offense, but it was enough to make it official. When she received the citation, witnesses said she exploded in the HOA office, yelling about corruption, favoritism, and rural terrorists. The board president tried to calm her down, but she turned her anger toward him too, accusing the entire association of failing their community. That was the moment the HOA began to turn on her. Within a week, several board members quietly resigned. The group chat went silent. The Facebook group where she had once ruled the comment sections turned against her, with residents mocking her obsession and posting memes about the bull guarding the neighborhood. But Karen wasn't finished. The final incident came 2 nights later, on a cold, clear evening lit only by the moon. The narrator was inside when Duke started bellowing, deep, thunderous roars that echoed through the valley. It wasn't the sound of a restless animal. It was the kind of noise that meant trouble. He grabbed his flashlight and ran outside. The pasture gate was open. The sight stopped him cold. Karen's SUV was stuck halfway in the ditch near the fence, its front end buried in mud. The headlights illuminated a torn section of rail and a bent gate hanging off one hinge. The engine was still running, and in front of the vehicle stood Duke. The bull's stance was rigid, his head low, snorting steam into the night air. Karen was inside the SUV, gripping the wheel, panic written all over her face. She must have tried to drive through again, maybe to prove her point, maybe just out of spite. But this time, Duke wasn't having it. The bull moved closer, hooves digging into the soft earth. He lowered his head and gave a short, sharp grunt. Karen revved the engine, but the tires only spun deeper into the mud. The sound and light made Duke angrier. He pawed the ground once, twice, and then he charged. The impact wasn't a full collision like before. It was a heavy, deliberate shove that rocked the SUV backward. The front bumper cracked, the metal folding like paper. Karen screamed, her horn blaring in panic, but Duke didn't let up. He gave another hard nudge to the side panel, leaving a deep dent before stepping back, his breath heavy and his tail flicking. By the time the narrator reached the fence line, Duke had already retreated, satisfied that he had defended his territory. Karen threw the SUV into reverse and managed to back out of the ditch, her tires throwing mud in every direction. She sped off without looking back, one headlight flickering like a wounded eye. The narrator stood in silence, flashlight beams sweeping over the wrecked fence, the deep hoof prints and the muddy ruts. It was chaos, but there was something poetic about it. The bull hadn't been trained for revenge. He had simply done what nature told him: protect his ground from anything that didn't belong. The next day, the sheriff came again. This time, the report spoke for itself. Karen's SUV had visible damage: broken bumper, dented panels, cracked windshield. She insisted the bull had attacked unprovoked. The deputies listened patiently, but after reviewing the security footage, the same cameras she'd once mocked, they saw the truth. She had driven onto private land again after being warned multiple times. The sheriff issued another citation, this one serious enough to carry real consequences: trespassing, reckless endangerment, property damage. The HOA couldn't save her this time. In fact, they refused to even acknowledge her complaints. The board issued a public statement distancing the community from her actions. By evening, her house was quiet. Curtains drawn, SUV gone from the driveway. For the first time in months, there was no sign of her outside. No patrols, no photos, no letters. Just silence. The narrator spent the next few days repairing the fence, again, and making sure the pasture was secure. Duke seemed calmer after that night, as if he understood that the fight was finally over. The land felt peaceful again, the way it had before all the chaos began. But deep down, the narrator knew it wasn't quite finished. People like Karen didn't vanish quietly. They regrouped. They plotted. Still, there was a strange satisfaction in the way things had unfolded. Nature had drawn its own line between right and wrong, and Duke had enforced it better than any HOA ever could. As the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the pasture, the narrator stood by the repaired fence and watched Duke graze peacefully. The world was calm again, at least for now, and in that quiet, he couldn't help but wonder what Karen's next move would be, or if she'd finally learned what happens when you pick a fight with a bull. For a few brief weeks, the neighborhood returned to something resembling normal. The mornings were quiet again. The road in front of the property no longer echoed with the sound of Karen's SUV. The HOA Facebook group had gone silent, and no new letters arrived in the mail. The air felt lighter, as if the whole community had finally taken a deep breath after holding it for too long. But silence can be deceptive. The narrator had lived long enough to know that people like Karen didn't quit. They hid, they planned, and they waited until the next opportunity to strike. Still, part of him hoped she'd finally accepted defeat. After all, the legal citations, the public humiliation, and the social fallout should have been enough to convince anyone to let go. Then one Friday morning, a black sedan pulled up at the end of the gravel driveway. It wasn't the sheriff this time. It was a man in a suit, holding a briefcase and an envelope. He introduced himself as a lawyer representing the HOA. The moment the narrator saw the paperwork, he knew exactly who had put him up to it. Karen. The envelope contained a cease and desist order drafted by the association's attorney. It claimed that Duke posed a persistent threat to public safety and demanded his immediate removal from the property. Attached were photographs of the fence, Karen's damaged SUV, and even a few stills pulled from the security footage, conveniently cropped to make it look like Duke was the aggressor. It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate swing from someone who couldn't stand losing. The narrator didn't argue. He simply took the papers, thanked the lawyer for his time, and closed the door. Inside, he called his own attorney, a quiet, practical man who had been handling rural property disputes for decades. After reviewing the documents, he laughed outright. The HOA had no authority. The land was outside their boundaries. The entire order was baseless. It was over before it even began. But Karen didn't see it that way. When the county clerk formally dismissed the HOA's claim a week later, she lost control. She sent angry emails to the board, accusing them of betrayal. She stormed into the next HOA meeting demanding they take action, or she would expose their incompetence. When no one supported her, she turned her fury toward the neighbors, shouting from her front yard about living next to a menace and being abandoned by her own community. The HOA finally issued her an official reprimand for harassment and misuse of funds. A few residents even filed complaints of their own. For the first time, Karen was the one being investigated. The narrator stayed quiet through it all. He didn't need to gloat. The situation was handling itself. Then one night everything came to a head. It was just past midnight when the dog started barking. Low, frantic howls that pulled the narrator out of sleep. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. The pasture was calm, the wind still, but something felt wrong. Then he saw the glow. Across the field, near the far corner of the fence, a small flame flickered in the darkness. It was faint at first, then brighter. Someone had set the fence on fire. He sprinted across the yard, grabbed the hose, and doused the flames before they spread. The fire had only burned through a few rails, but the intent was unmistakable. It wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to destroy what he'd built. Again. He called the sheriff immediately. When the deputies arrived, they found footprints leading from the road to the burned section. The tracks matched the soles of a woman's shoes. The tire marks nearby matched a familiar pattern. Karen's SUV. It didn't take long for them to piece it together. She'd been seen driving through the area earlier that evening, circling the property more than once. The sheriff himself went to her house that night. What happened there was never fully shared, but the next morning her SUV was gone. She didn't come back. For days, her house sat dark, curtains drawn, mailbox overflowing. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn, white, glossy, and silent. The HOA president quietly confirmed what everyone already suspected. Karen had been removed from the board and fined by the county for property damage and harassment. She was leaving the community for good. The neighborhood exhaled. Life on the ranch slowly returned to what it had been before the chaos. The new section of the fence stood stronger than ever, reinforced with metal posts and fresh timber. Duke roamed the field freely again, content and unbothered, his thick coat shining in the afternoon sun. The neighbors, once distant, began waving again as they passed by. Some even stopped to chat at the fence line, joking about the legend of the bull who protected the neighborhood. The story spread far beyond the HOA boundaries. People whispered about it in town, and someone even posted a short video online showing the aftermath of the wrecked SUV. It went viral overnight. The narrator didn't seek attention, but he couldn't help but smile when he overheard a store clerk telling the story to a customer. How a pushy HOA lady learned the hard way that the countryside played by different rules. Months passed and the peace held. The ranch thrived. The grass grew thick again. The barn gleamed with a new coat of paint, and the air was filled with the easy rhythm of normal life. Every now and then, the narrator would glance toward Karen's old house. It remained empty for a while before new owners moved in, a quiet couple who kept to themselves and had no interest in HOA politics. It felt like the chapter had finally closed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, the narrator leaned on the fence and watched Duke grazing near the edge of the pasture. The bull lifted his head, glanced toward him, and gave a slow, satisfied snort, as if to say it was all over. The narrator chuckled quietly, patting the fence rail. For all the trouble, it had been a lesson, a reminder that some battles aren't fought with words or paperwork, but with patience, truth, and a little bit of nature's own justice. Karen had tried to win through intimidation, through lies and manipulation, but in the end, her downfall came from her own stubbornness. The HOA had distanced themselves, the community had seen her true colors, and the law had done what it was supposed to do. The land was quiet again. The peace restored. As the last light faded from the sky, the narrator turned toward the house, the sound of crickets filling the air. Behind him, Duke let out one final grunt before settling down near the fence he had once defended so fiercely. The fight was over. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like home again.